The morning started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook Falls. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint golden streaks across my grandfather's old barn through the window. That barn had stood on our property since 1887, weathered and beautiful, a monument to 4 generations of the Harrison family. The wood was aged to a perfect silver gray, and morning glories climbed up the eastern wall every spring without fail. My grandfather built furniture in that barn. My father restored classic cars there. And me? I'd turned it into my sanctuary, a place where I could think, plan, and escape the chaos of my demanding job. Then I saw Marcus Chen, my mail carrier, walking up the gravel driveway with an expression I'd never seen before, something between pity and concern. He handed me a thick manila envelope with the Cascade Ridge Homeowners Association logo embossed on the corner, and my stomach dropped. I'd been part of this HOA for exactly 4 months, ever since the neighborhood boundaries expanded to include the historically rural properties along Old Miller Road. 4 months of increasingly absurd notices about my lawn height, my mailbox color, and the rustic aesthetic of my front fence. But this envelope felt different, heavier, more official. I tore it open right there on the porch, and the words seemed to blur together at first. Notice of violation. Structural eyesore. Diminishes property values. Non-compliant with community standards. And then, at the bottom, in bold red letters, mandatory demolition required within 30 days. My hands actually shook. They wanted to demolish my family's barn, the barn where my grandmother taught me to paint when I was 7 years old. The barn that held every Christmas decoration, every box of memories, every piece of furniture my grandfather had crafted by hand. They were calling it a derelict structure and claiming it violated Section 7.3.2 of their newly amended bylaws. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a different emotion. First shock, then disbelief, then something close to rage. The letter was signed by Patricia Whitmore, HOA president, and countersigned by the entire board: Robert Caldwell, Susan Martinez, and Derek Thompson. 4 people I'd never even met had decided my family's history was worth less than their property values. The letter continued with clinical precision, outlining how they'd conducted a visual assessment of properties in the expanded zone and determined that my barn, along with associated outbuildings, needed immediate removal. They'd even attached photographs taken from the road, grainy and unflattering, making my beloved barn look like something from a horror movie rather than the historic structure it was. They mentioned safety concerns, potential harboring of pests, and inconsistency with the established aesthetic guidelines of Cascade Ridge. What they didn't mention was that my barn was listed on the county's Historic Preservation Registry. What they didn't mention was that it had survived 2 floods, a tornado in 1974, and had been featured in a documentary about American agricultural architecture. What they didn't mention was that some things matter more than cookie-cutter conformity. I called the HOA office immediately. A chirpy receptionist named Bethany answered, and I could hear her smile fade as I explained why I was calling. "Oh, you're the barn property," she said, as if that explained everything. "Mrs. Whitmore is very firm about this one. She says it's a priority issue." "Can I speak with her?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "She's not available today, but the letter outlines everything clearly, Mr. Harrison. You have 30 days to comply, or the association will pursue legal action and potentially place a lien on your property to cover demolition costs." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. 30 days. They were giving me 30 days to erase 4 generations of family history. I walked back to the barn, running my hand along the weathered wood siding, feeling every groove and nail hole. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the high windows. My grandfather's workbench still stood against the far wall, tools hanging in the exact spots where he'd placed them 40 years ago. That's when I made my decision. They wanted a fight. They were going to get one. But not the fight they expected. I sat down on an old wooden crate and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts. I needed allies. I needed information. And most importantly, I needed to understand exactly what legal ground I was standing on. What Patricia Whitmore and her board didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know from their gated section of Cascade Ridge with its identical houses and manicured lawns, was that I'd kept it quiet in my personal life, especially after the HOA boundaries expanded. I liked the separation between my public role and my private sanctuary. I drove an old truck, wore flannel shirts on weekends, and nobody in the new HOA sections had bothered to connect the dots. To them, I was just James Harrison, the guy with the old barn on the edge of their perfect neighborhood. But as I sat there in my grandfather's barn, reading that demolition notice for the 4th time, I realized something important. Sometimes the best way to fight bullies isn't to match their aggression. Sometimes the most powerful move is patience, strategy, letting them walk right into a trap of their own making. I had 30 days. That was plenty of time. The next morning, I did something I rarely do. I took a personal day. Or rather, I cleared my schedule and told my assistant Carol that I'd be working from home on community outreach, which wasn't technically a lie. I was just reaching out to a very specific part of my community, the Cascade Ridge HOA board. I started by doing what any good mayor would do: research. I pulled every document related to the HOA's expansion, their amended bylaws, and most importantly, their approval process for those amendments. What I found made my coffee taste bitter. The expansion vote had been rushed through during a special meeting held on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when most working residents couldn't attend. Only 42 homeowners had been present out of 317 in the expanded zone, and the vote had passed 51 to 49%. Barely legal, definitely sketchy. But the real gold mine was in the fine print of their demolition authority. According to the county clerk's office, where I happened to have direct access, the HOA had never filed for the proper permits to enforce demolitions on historically registered properties. My barn's registry number was sitting right there in the database, clear as day. They either hadn't checked, or they were hoping I wouldn't know. I spent 3 hours that morning making calls. First to Daniel Reeves, the county's chief building inspector and an old friend from my campaign days. "James," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I've been waiting for someone to challenge this HOA. They've been aggressive with 3 other properties too. One family is losing their grandmother's garden because it's too informal. This is exactly why we have historic preservation codes." Next, I called Margaret Sullivan, head of the local historical society. She nearly shouted into the phone when I told her about the demolition notice. "That barn is in our archive. It's been photographed, documented, and assessed. It's one of 12 remaining post and beam barns in the entire county. Tell me you're fighting this, James." "Oh, I'm fighting it," I assured her, "but I need your help documenting everything." By noon, I had a plan forming, but I needed to see exactly who I was dealing with. So I did something I'd never done before. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, as a resident, not as mayor. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center in the heart of Cascade Ridge. Wednesday afternoon, I received my second letter. This one was even more aggressive. Apparently, my lack of immediate response indicated I was unwilling to cooperate with community standards. Patricia Whitmore had escalated, stating that if I didn't submit a demolition plan by Friday, they'd schedule an emergency board vote to authorize forced compliance measures. I called Bethany again. This time she sounded nervous. "Mr. Harrison, I'm just the receptionist, but between you and me, Mrs. Whitmore has been really focused on your property. She drives by it every morning on her way to yoga, and I've heard her call it that eyesore at least a dozen times." "Does she know anything about the property's history?" I asked. "I don't think she cares, honestly. She's very determined." Thursday evening came, and I drove to the community center in my old truck wearing jeans and a work jacket. The parking lot was full of BMWs, Mercedes, and Teslas. My truck looked like it had wandered in from another decade. Perfect. The meeting room was sterile and cold, with fluorescent lights and rows of folding chairs facing a raised table where the board sat. Patricia Whitmore was exactly what I'd imagined. Perfectly styled silver hair, designer glasses, and an expression that suggested she'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by asserting dominance. Robert Caldwell looked like a retired executive, all hard edges and golf tan. Susan Martinez seemed uncomfortable, constantly checking her phone, and Derek Thompson was typing on a laptop, barely paying attention. "I don't think she cares, honestly. She's very determined." Thursday evening came, and I drove to the community center in my old truck wearing jeans and a work jacket. The parking lot was full of BMWs, Mercedes, and Teslas. My truck looked like it had wandered in from another decade. Perfect. The meeting room was sterile and cold, with fluorescent lights and rows of folding chairs facing a raised table where the board sat. Patricia Whitmore was exactly what I'd imagined. Perfectly styled silver hair, designer glasses, and an expression that suggested she'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by asserting dominance. Robert Caldwell looked like a retired executive, all hard edges and golf tan. Susan Martinez seemed uncomfortable, constantly checking her phone, and Derek Thompson was typing on a laptop, barely paying attention. About 20 residents were scattered in the chairs. Most looked bored, a few looked angry. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. They breezed through standard business, approving minutes, discussing landscaping contracts, debating the color of new street signs. Then she smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. Item 7 on the agenda, she announced, concerns non-compliant structures in the expanded zone, specifically the property at 1847 Old Miller Road, owned by James Harrison. Every head turned toward me. I didn't move. Patricia continued, pulling up photos of my barn on a projector screen. In her presentation, she'd chosen the worst angles, the most dramatic shadows. This structure represents everything we sought to eliminate when we expanded our community boundaries. It's unsightly, potentially dangerous, and significantly impacts surrounding property values. Mr. Harrison was issued a notice of mandatory demolition but has failed to respond appropriately. Robert Caldwell leaned forward. I drove by that property yesterday. It's worse than the photos show. I saw peeling paint, broken windows, and what looked like structural damage. That was a lie. My barn had no broken windows, but I stayed quiet. Susan Martinez spoke up hesitantly. Shouldn't we verify if there are any historic designations? I thought I heard something about old barns in this area being protected. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. We checked. There's nothing official that would prevent us from enforcing our standards. The county's preservation list is outdated and non-binding anyway. Another lie. And this one, I'd make her regret. Derek Thompson finally looked up from his laptop. I move that we authorize the association's legal team to pursue forced demolition if Mr. Harrison doesn't comply within 7 days. I second, Robert added immediately. All in favor? Patricia asked. 4 hands went up. I stood slowly, and the room went quiet. Every eye in that sterile community center room locked onto me as I rose from my folding chair. Patricia Whitmore's perfectly shaped eyebrows lifted slightly, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. Was I going to make a scene? Would I beg? She looked almost eager for it. I'd like to address the board, I said calmly, my voice carrying easily across the room despite not raising it. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. Public comment period was at the beginning of the meeting, Mr. Harrison. You missed it. I'm aware, but since you just voted on a motion directly affecting my property without giving me an opportunity to respond, I'm invoking my right as a resident to address items specifically related to my property. That's in your own bylaws, section 4.2.7. I'd read every word of their documentation over the past 2 days. I saw Derek Thompson quickly pull up something on his laptop, then nod reluctantly at Patricia. She gave me a smile that could freeze water. Very well, you have 3 minutes. I walked to the front of the room slowly, deliberately, taking my time. Let them wait. Let them wonder. When I turned to face the board, I positioned myself so I could see both them and the residents behind me. My name is James Harrison. My family has owned the property at 1847 Old Miller Road since 1887. That's 138 years. I let that number hang in the air. The barn you're calling an eyesore was built by my great-grandfather Samuel Harrison using timber from this very land. Post and beam construction, all hand-hewn joints, not a single nail in the original frame. It survived the flood of 1928, the tornado of 1974, and every storm in between. Patricia interrupted. Mr. Harrison, we're not interested in sentimental history. This is about property standards and... I'm not finished, I said. And something in my tone made her stop, not aggressive, just absolutely certain. You mentioned checking for historic designations and finding nothing. That's interesting because my barn has been on the county's Historic Preservation Registry since 1994. Registry number HP 1847B. It's also been documented by the state. Susan Martinez's face went pale. Derek Thompson stopped typing. I pulled out my phone and turned it to show the screen. I have the documentation right here. And according to County Code Section 12-488, any structure on the Historic Preservation Registry is protected from demolition by homeowners associations unless the structure poses an immediate threat to public safety, which requires certification by a licensed structural engineer, not a visual assessment from the road. Robert Caldwell's golf tan seemed to fade a shade. We weren't aware of... You weren't aware because you didn't check, I said simply. You assumed, and based on that assumption, you voted to violate both county code and state historic preservation law. Patricia recovered quickly. I'd give her that. Even if what you say is true, Mr. Harrison, there are procedures for historic structures, regular maintenance requirements, safety inspections, all of which I've completed, I interrupted, pulling papers from inside my jacket. Here's my last structural inspection dated 3 months ago. The engineer certified it as structurally sound with a remaining lifespan of at least 50 years with basic maintenance. Here's my maintenance log. Here's my insurance documentation specifically for historic properties. And here, I placed the final sheet on their table, is a letter from the county building inspector's office dated today confirming that my property is in full compliance with all county codes and preservation requirements. The room was absolutely silent. A few residents had pulled out their phones, probably recording. Good. Patricia's voice went cold. This doesn't change the fact that your property doesn't meet our community standards. We have aesthetic guidelines. Which supersede county historic preservation law? I asked. Because I'm pretty sure that's not how the legal hierarchy works. HOA rules can't override county and state codes. That's basic regulatory law. We'll see what our lawyers say about that, Derek Thompson muttered. I'm sure you will, I said. And while they're reviewing the case, they might want to inform you that pursuing forced demolition of a historically registered structure could expose every board member to personal liability under state preservation statutes. We're talking potential fines of up to $50,000 per board member plus damages. I watched that number land like a punch. Susan Martinez actually gasped. Robert Caldwell's hand went to his collar, loosening his tie. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Now let's talk about those photos you showed. I gestured to the projector screen, still displaying the unflattering images of my barn. You mentioned broken windows. There are no broken windows on my barn. You mentioned structural damage. The last inspection certified it as sound. You mentioned peeling paint. My barn has never been painted. It's natural weathered wood, which is part of its historic character. These statements constitute either gross negligence in your assessment or deliberate misrepresentation to influence a board vote. Patricia stood abruptly. Mr. Harrison, I think we've heard enough. I'm not finished, I repeated. And this time my voice carried the weight of 6 years in public office, 6 years of facing down developers, lawyers, and bullies who thought rules didn't apply to them. You have 7 days to rescind this demolition order and issue a formal apology for this violation of my rights as a property owner. If you don't, I'll file suit not just against the HOA, but against each board member personally for harassment, abuse of authority, and attempted destruction of historic property. The room erupted. Residents started talking among themselves. Someone shouted, "This is exactly what they did to the Johnsons." Another voice, "My grandmother's garden is next." Patricia tried to regain control, banging her gavel. "This meeting is adjourned." I walked out of that community center with my head high, but my heart was pounding. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in HOA overreach and desperation. Friday morning, I received an email from Derek Thompson, sent at 6:47 a.m., which told me he'd been up all night, requesting an informal mediation meeting to discuss mutual concerns. The tone had shifted dramatically from the authoritarian demolition orders. Now they wanted to talk. I ignored it. Let them sweat. By Friday afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. First, it was Bethany from the HOA office, her cheerful receptionist voice replaced with genuine stress. "Mr. Harrison, the board is very eager to speak with you. Mrs. Whitmore asked me to call and schedule a time that's convenient for you." "Tell Mrs. Whitmore I'm considering my legal options," I said. "I'll be in touch when I've made my decision." Margaret didn't sit down, didn't break eye contact, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a steel edge that made several board members shift uncomfortably. "I'm not appealing anything yet, Mr. Blackwood. I'm asking for transparency. This barn is a historic structure maintained in excellent condition on property that has never been part of your HOA. I'd like you to explain to everyone here how you justify claiming authority over land outside your development and threatening to destroy a piece of local history that predates this entire neighborhood by over a century." Preston's face flushed, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he wasn't used to being challenged publicly. "Your property may predate the development, but the structure in question materially affects the property values and visual harmony of our community, which gives us authority under Section 12.4 of our revised charter. The barn is an eyesore, it's deteriorating, and it doesn't meet our architectural standards. This isn't personal, it's about maintaining the quality of life and investment protection that our residents expect." His words were rehearsed, probably the same argument he'd used to convince the board to approve the violation notice, but they landed differently in the silent room now that someone was pushing back. Margaret let his answer hang in the air for a moment before responding, giving everyone time to process what they'd heard, giving Preston time to feel confident that he'd won this exchange. "An eyesore," Margaret repeated softly, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet intensity. A structure built by hand in 1887, using traditional timber framing techniques that are now considered historic craftsmanship, maintained by 4 generations of my family, is an eyesore. But these identical houses, these cookie-cutter buildings that all look exactly the same, that have no character, no history, no connection to this land, these are somehow protecting property values. She paused, looking around the room at the other residents, making eye contact with several who seemed to be really listening now. "I want everyone here to understand what's happening. The HOA is claiming authority over property it doesn't own, threatening a historic structure because it doesn't match their aesthetic preferences, and using legal intimidation to force compliance. And if they can do this to me, to my barn, they can do it to any of you, whenever they decide that something you own or something you value doesn't fit their vision of perfection." The words hit like a hammer, and Margaret could see the impact rippling through the room. Thomas Wheeler, the veteran she'd spoken with during her investigation, nodded slowly from his seat 3 rows up. Rebecca Martinez crossed her arms and leaned forward, her expression intense. Even some of the residents Margaret didn't recognize seemed troubled by what she'd said, as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing something they'd sensed but never articulated. Preston Blackwood's composure cracked slightly, his voice rising as he responded with barely controlled anger. "You're misrepresenting the situation and disrupting this meeting. We have clear legal authority, we've followed proper procedures, and your emotional appeals don't change the facts. The violation stands, the 60-day deadline stands, and if you refuse to comply, we will proceed with enforcement as outlined in your notice. This discussion is over." He raised his gavel, preparing to move on to the next agenda item, but Margaret wasn't finished. She'd been building to this moment, laying the groundwork, drawing Preston out, letting him demonstrate exactly the kind of authoritarian arrogance that she'd seen in his enforcement patterns. Now she was ready to pivot, to shift the battlefield, to introduce the element that Preston Blackwood hadn't anticipated and couldn't possibly prepare for. "The discussion isn't over, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said, her voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable command that made Preston's hand freeze mid-gavel rap. "Because there's something you and this board need to understand before you proceed any further with your threats against my property." She took a breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to reveal, knowing that this moment would change everything, not just for her barn, but for the entire dynamic of power in Riverside Springs. "I didn't come here tonight just as a concerned property owner, though that would be reason enough. I came here as someone who's spent the last 30 years working in public service, including the last 6 years in an elected position that gives me certain insights into how government authority should and shouldn't be used." Margaret paused, watching Preston's expression shift from anger to confusion to the first dawning awareness that something significant was happening, that he'd miscalculated somehow. "Mr. Blackwood, board members, residents of Riverside Springs, I think it's time I properly introduced myself. My name is Margaret Chen, and in addition to being the owner of that barn you're so eager to demolish, I'm also the current mayor of this city, a position I've held since 2019 when I was elected with 72% of the vote and re-elected last year with even stronger support. And as mayor, I have to tell you that this HOA's interpretation of its authority, its enforcement methods, and its treatment of property owners are deeply concerning from both a legal and an ethical standpoint." The room erupted into chaos, residents turning to each other in shock, board members frozen in disbelief, and Preston Blackwood standing at his podium with his mouth slightly open, the gavel hanging limply in his hand, his entire worldview crashing down around him as he realized that the fight he'd thought would be a routine enforcement action had just become something far more complicated and dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The silence that followed Margaret's revelation lasted only seconds before the community center exploded into confused voices and urgent whispers. Residents pulling out their phones to confirm what they'd just heard, board members leaning toward each other in panicked consultation, and Preston Blackwood standing frozen at his podium like a man who'd just watched his entire carefully constructed empire begin to collapse. Margaret remained standing in the back row, calm and composed, letting the chaos wash over her without adding to it, giving everyone time to process this fundamental shift in power dynamics. She could see the exact moment when Preston's brain caught up with reality, when the implications of her announcement penetrated his shock and transformed into something more dangerous, a cornered animal's desperate aggression. His face flushed deep red, his hands gripping the podium edges, and when he finally spoke, his voice shook with barely controlled fury. "This is highly inappropriate, using your political position to intimidate this board and interfere with legitimate HOA governance. The mayor's office has no jurisdiction over homeowners associations, which are private organizations, and your attempt to leverage your title to avoid compliance with community standards is exactly the kind of political corruption that undermines public trust in government." Preston's words were calculated, a lawyer's instinct to go on offense when defense seemed impossible, but they rang hollow in the charged atmosphere of the room. Margaret had anticipated this response, had known that Preston would try to frame her revelation as an abuse of power rather than a simple statement of fact, and she was ready for it. "I'm not leveraging anything, Mr. Blackwood. I'm simply introducing myself properly, something you never bothered to do before sending your violation notice. You assumed I was just another powerless homeowner you could bully into submission, and that assumption was your mistake, not my corruption. As mayor, I have no direct authority over your HOA, you're correct about that. But what I do have is a deep understanding of how local governance works, extensive knowledge of property law and municipal codes, and a very strong interest in ensuring that organizations claiming quasi-governmental authority in our city operate ethically and within their actual legal boundaries." She moved forward through the rows of chairs, walking slowly toward the front of the room, her presence commanding attention without aggression. "I've spent the last 3 weeks researching your operations, Mr. Blackwood, and what I've found is deeply troubling. You've systematically expanded your claimed authority beyond your original charter, targeting properties that aren't actually part of your development. You've implemented increasingly restrictive rules that serve no legitimate purpose beyond enforcing your personal aesthetic preferences. And you've used fines and legal threats to intimidate residents who don't have the—" Margaret reached the front row and turned to address the entire room, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent years speaking at city council meetings and community forums. "Thomas Wheeler, would you stand up, please?" The elderly veteran in the third row stood slowly, his military bearing evident despite his age, and Margaret gestured toward him. Tom received a violation notice because he parked his RV in his own driveway for 3 days while preparing for a trip to visit his grandchildren. The fine was $500, and when Tom explained his situation and asked for an exception, his appeal was denied. "Rebecca Martinez, would you stand?" The single mother near the back rose hesitantly, and Margaret continued. "Rebecca grows vegetables in her front yard because she's trying to provide healthy food for her children on a limited budget. The HOA cited her for violating the ornamental landscaping rule and threatened her with daily fines if she didn't tear out her garden and replace it with grass and approved shrubs. There are others, more stories just like these, a pattern of enforcement that prioritizes aesthetic control over community well-being, that treats residents like subjects to be managed rather than neighbors to be served." The impact of Margaret's words was visible across the room, residents nodding in recognition or sympathy, several pulling out their own phones to document what was happening, and the board members looking increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of their organization's overreach was laid bare for everyone to see. Preston Blackwood's composure shattered completely, his voice rising to a near shout as he responded with desperate aggression. "This is a witch hunt. You're cherry-picking isolated incidents and twisting them to serve your agenda. Every enforcement action we've taken has been based on clear violations of rules that every resident agreed to when they bought property in this development. We maintain high standards because that's what protects property values and quality of life. If you don't like our rules, you're free to move somewhere else with lower standards and watch your home value plummet." The response was classic Preston, doubling down on authority when questioned, dismissing legitimate concerns as personal attacks, framing any criticism as a threat to the community's well-being. But this time his words landed differently, without the automatic agreement and support he'd grown accustomed to receiving. Gerald Morrison, the vice president who'd been Preston's closest ally, shifted uncomfortably in his seat and raised a tentative hand. "Preston, maybe we should take a step back here and consider whether some of our recent enforcement actions have been too aggressive. The mayor raises some valid concerns about how we've interpreted our jurisdiction, and I think we need to have a serious discussion about this as a board." The defection was devastating, a crack in Preston's foundation that threatened to bring down the entire structure of his authority. Margaret watched the dynamics shift in real time, saw other board members nodding along with Gerald's suggestion, saw Preston's face cycle through disbelief and betrayal and impotent rage. This was the moment she'd been working toward, not just defending her barn, but exposing the fundamental problems with how the HOA operated, creating an opening for real reform. But Margaret wasn't cruel, and she didn't want to completely destroy Preston Blackwood despite his overreach and arrogance. She wanted change, accountability, and a better balance between community standards and individual rights, and that required giving Preston a path forward rather than just backing him into a corner. "I'm not here to destroy your HOA or to eliminate all community standards," Margaret said, her tone shifting from confrontational to conciliatory. "I recognize that homeowners associations can serve legitimate purposes, protecting property values and maintaining basic aesthetic harmony. But there's a difference between reasonable standards and authoritarian control, between community service and personal power trips. What I'm proposing is simple. Withdraw the violation notice against my property, conduct a comprehensive review of your enforcement policies with input from residents, and implement reforms that balance community standards with respect for individual property rights and historic preservation."